to elect
Well, look, I'm
JFK.
going to tell you that
They,
happened in the Deep South as well, right after the Civil
yeah,
War.
yeah,
You got to understand, it was the Republican Party, it was the Republicans of Lincoln that
right.
fought against the Confederacy, the Democrats of the Old South. And they were the most. I mean, obviously they were racist. They believe in enslaving an entire race of people. They did it the same way. Listen, let me tell you, they did a number on Irish Americans. They did a number on American Indians, ungodly things that was done to them. um, Probably, I would tell you, when I look through my family history, I came from an Irish American Indian background, because the Irish, when they came over, you know, as my grandmother would tell me, no decent white person would marry an Irish person. You know what I mean? So that's what they would say. So they either married into the African American community, or they married in to the American Indian community, and that's what happened. And the product of that is guys like James McCormick and so many others. Um, I'm just going to tell you that this ballot box stuffing was bad in the South, in the Deep
Hmm.
South, really bad in the Deep South. Now that changed, obviously. They did a flop, where the Democrats, under FDR and JFK and some of those, what I would say your more prominent, leaders. Something happened during the Clinton administration
Right.
that I believe that started the downward spiral. It really shot into hyperdrive under Barack Obama,
Yeah.
to where you saw more people. When I was a kid growing up, if you ever openly professed that you were a communist, you'd get beat up. I mean, people, I mean, look, the Russians were still our enemy,
That's right.
and they still are, by the way. Don't you ever forget that. The Russians and the Chinese, they're still your enemy. And the North Koreans and the Iranians. Uh, but but through all of that political corruption, there's one group that continues to come out, and that is the so-called quote unquote liberal group. It's the liberal group is the only group that would embrace Al Qaeda, that will embrace Hamas.
Hmm.
They do. They embrace them.
Yeah.
They embrace communism. They embrace socialism, things that run afoul against the U.S. Constitution and what we stand for as Americans. Um, they embraced slavery. You know what I mean? They were a liberal party. They embraced slavery. They weren't the party of back then. You know what I mean? They were a very
And
liberal.
we need to remind people
Yeah,
in schools that Republicans were formed. The party was formed to free the slaves.
that's
The
exactly why
KKK,
they were formed.
and it's documented. And
Yeah,
the KKK, those were our Democrats.
yeah,
Republicans voted to give women the right to vote.
yeah. Well, and
Um,
look, that's a fact. And they killed Abraham Lincoln.
that's
Okay,
right. That's right.
now they cut off their nose to spite their face, because had they kept Abraham Lincoln alive, had he not been murdered at Ford Theater by an assassin, a Confederate assassin, who was also a very well known Democrat, okay, named John Wilkes Booth,
Right.
and if that had
To
not
people,
happened,
I'm sorry, to people up in Montreal, the South created a slush fund that was based in Montreal, where Booth would travel up to Montreal, dude, and that's where they did the Confederate money transactions.
mhm.
Canada was such a safe haven, of course, but yeah,
Well,
Booth
sure,
went up
yeah,
there.
yeah.
He went up there to pick up the money. I think it was like $1,600 to fulfill the assassination. There you go.
Well, there you go. There's a piece of that history.
Yeah.
But had they not murdered Abraham Lincoln and allowed Vice President Johnson to become the president, Lincoln said, "We're going to let him up easy." That's what he said. They said to play Dixie at the celebration in honor of their enemy, to give them grace and allow them to rejoin the Union.
That's right.
He was going to allow the slaves in the South, the freed people in the South, to go back to Africa if they wanted to. Now, that's
Yeah.
some people say that's an unpopular decision that he was making, but that's a very true statement. He was giving them the option.
Right. Right.
Okay. He was going to also, he's the one that came up with the 40 acres and a mule. And I believe that he would have fulfilled that promise wholeheartedly had he not been assassinated. So understand, in April of 1865, everything got changed because they killed the man who was making the promises. Now, when the vice president got in, he said, we are going to make them, he says, we are going to make them feel the weight of our boot. And he did. And he put an occupation army in the South, though
Right.
1877,
Right.
primarily African American troops that were down there. They put people in positions and they didn't just defeat them, but then they unleashed the whole carpetbaggerman group of people
Mm-hmm.
who they had, the carpetbaggers had no loyalty to America. They had no loyalty to anybody but themselves. And a lot of them became millionaires.
Right.
So a lot of the big landowners, and they were ultimately they were pro themselves, and they really were probably pro slavery as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because when they got over and they bought all these plantations because taxes foreclosed on these people, and they bought them for pennies on the dollar.
That's right.
And then they turned them into these great big corporations, you know what I mean? And they went right back into the cotton industry and all these things.
Right.
And they just found a different group of people to enslave. Okay. And they found a different group of people to force, they still become the masters. And you see this whole work through the Industrial Revolution of the 1890s and then all the way up to the Great Depression and da da da. All these things happen. All of that came from corruption in politics. You know, you kill the president, you put the person in there that you want in there, and then you stuff the ballot boxes and you elect the local officials who will carry out your wills. That's how you take over. And that's what happened. And for the longest time, they were all called Dixiecrats. You know, the Democrats were called Dixiecrats. And then somewhere,
That's right.
I'm going to say after Clinton, because it was pretty much still a safe haven if you were a Democrat and you espoused the JFK views, you were going to get elected, and you know they weren't that bad. You know, people actually communicated and talked. But
Right.
when you had Obama get in, oh buddy,
Yeah.
changed.
My commentary in the past, I've said this a million times, Captain, is everything changed, yes, indeed, with Clinton. Why? Why? He was the first boomer president
Yeah.
coming out of the '60s campuses.
Hmm.
The New Age movement calls it moral relativism, historical revisionism, one world government, single currency, get Jesus out of our lives. Men are
Sure. Yeah.
crap. Archie Bunker was the first
Yeah.
campaign to say that men are crap. So I think again, just to touch base, always generationally. I think Bill Clinton started it, and I'm just going to say, I've never said this publicly before. There's no question, and I say even statistically, Barack Obama was the most divisive president in our generation.
Yeah.
Just the word
Absolutely.
is divisive. That means simply uh, uh, dividing us. Captain, comments on that?
Yeah, no, look, I've said what I've said and I mean it, and it's historically accurate to make that
Right,
statement.
right,
And you know, President Biden, at whatever point that he was ever really in charge, I don't know. Okay. But I do know that it's the minions. It's the minions that are there. It's the people behind the screens, behind the curtains that are doing all of these things. And if you go and you dig into them, you see these very deep rooted, you know, they are pushing forward their personal agendas and not the
right.
agenda of the American people or the
That's
desire
right.
of the American people. That's why you don't have a vote in Alberta, because then you have to put forward, you know, the will of the people. What if they say, yes, we want to become the 51st state of the United States of America? And if they do, then you don't follow through with that. Then what are you? You're not following through. You're not taking care of your constituents. It's the same thing. Just put a, you know, look, make